Imagine that you live in a vast country with fertile land and illuminated palaces, yet most people possess nothing but a little bread and a great deal of patience. Imagine laws that are not written for everyone, justice that does not knock on every door, and a voice of the ordinary person that means nothing no matter how loud it becomes. Now ask yourself calmly, what happens when patience runs out? And what happens when ideas begin to slip into minds before they reach the streets? Tonight, we will not tell only the story of a revolution, but the story of an old world cracking and a new world being born amid chaos. This is the story of the French Revolution in the 18th century. France, from the outside, appeared to be a powerful and majestic state. Its territory was vast, its population larger than that of any other European country, its major cities full of life, and its palaces glittering under candlelight and gold. But behind this calm scene, something else was slowly and silently taking shape. France was living under what later came to be called the Old Regime, a system not built on equality, but on a clear division of society into classes, each with its own rights, and each with its own burdens or lack thereof. French society was divided into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, who possessed wide spiritual influence and vast lands, and received a steady income from tithes. They were close to power and largely exempt from heavy taxes. The second estate was the nobility, old families bearing hereditary titles and owning large tracts of land. They were not merely wealthy, but holders of legal privileges that granted them higher status and fewer responsibilities. Then came the third estate, which formed the overwhelming majority of the population, more than 95% of the French people, peasants working the fields, workers in the cities, artisans, and educated bourgeois who carried trade and pain, but not privilege. This class paid most of the taxes, paying the state, the church, and the landowners, while barely participating in decision-making. Poverty alone was not the problem. Many peasants had lived hard lives for generations. The deeper problem was the growing sense that this system was closed, one that did not allow upward mobility, did not recognize effort, and did not reward competence. The law was not the same for everyone, punishment varied by class, and taxes were imposed on those without power, while privileges were inherited like family names. Over the years, this unjust balance began to crack, not with a sudden explosion, but through the silent accumulation of anger, questions, and the feeling that something had to change. In France before the Revolution, injustice was not a passing incident or an administrative mistake. It was part of the very structure of the state, written into laws, drawn into classes, and accepted for centuries as something natural. But what seems natural for a long time can suddenly become unbearable. And here, before voices filled the streets, before banners were raised, before a single stone fell from prison walls, France was already standing on the edge of the storm. With a society weighed down by privileges on one side and burdens on the other, France entered a new phase in which the problem was no longer just the people, but the state itself, and a monarchy that was beginning to lose its ability to control events. When Louis XVI ascended the throne, he was a quiet young man with good intentions, but he inherited a state burdened with problems and debts accumulated over decades. He was not cruel by nature, nor inclined toward repression, but he was hesitant and indecisive at a time when the state needed firm and rapid decisions. The greatest problem France faced was money, or rather, the absence of it from the state treasury. France had spent enormous sums on wars, most notably its support of the American Revolution in the 1770s. The goal was to weaken Britain, the traditional rival, but the cost was massive debts the state could not repay. At the same time, the royal court lived a life completely detached from the reality of most people: palace festivities, luxurious clothing, and endless expenses. This extravagance was not the sole cause of the crisis, but it made it more visible and more provocative. The real problem lay in the tax system itself. The state desperately needed money, but could not collect it from where wealth actually existed. The classes that owned land and riches enjoyed broad exemptions, while the burden once again fell on those who had the least. The king and his advisors tried to fix this imbalance. Ideas were proposed to impose fair taxes on everyone, but every attempt collided with a solid wall. The nobility and privileged classes refused to give up anything. They did not see the crisis as existential, but as a direct threat to their status, and they used their political influence to block any reform that touched their privileges. Thus, the state found itself in a closed loop. It needed money, but could not change the system that prevented it from collecting it. It needed reform, but the very tools of reform were governed by the rules of the old regime. Over time, the financial crisis turned into a crisis of confidence. The people began to see that the state had no clear way out, and that the king, despite his position, was no longer able to control what was happening. By the 1780s, debts were suffocating, the treasury nearly empty, and temporary solutions no longer sufficient. An unprecedented step became unavoidable, a step that would shake the entire system, even if no one knew where it would lead. The problem, as many later believed, was not poverty alone, but the state's inability to reform itself from within. A system built on privilege cannot save itself without destroying part of its own foundation. And so, between a hesitant king, an empty treasury, and nobles refusing change, France approached a decisive moment. As the doors of political and financial reform closed, questions moved beyond money and taxes to reach the very core of power itself. At this moment, while the treasury was emptying and authority searched for urgent solutions, something else was growing in a completely different place, not in palaces or official councils, but in books, quiet salons and minds that began asking unfamiliar questions. In the second half of the 18th century, a movement spread in France that later became known as the Enlightenment. It was not an organized movement or a political party, but a wave of ideas calling on people to use their reason and to question everything that had long been considered an unchangeable truth. Thinkers began to speak of freedom not as a gift from the king, but as a natural right with which humans are born. They spoke of law not as a tool in the hands of authority, but as a single rule applied to everyone. The idea of the social contract emerged, a simple yet dangerous idea stating that authority does not come from heaven nor is it inherited by blood, but arises from an implicit agreement between ruler and ruled, and that the ruler loses legitimacy if he betrays that agreement. During this period, the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau circulated openly and secretly, speaking of popular sovereignty, the general will, and the equality of people in their origins, even if laws divided them. Voltaire's writings mocked fanaticism, attacked privilege, and called for freedom of thought and expression. Montesquieu introduced the idea of the separation of powers so that authority would not be concentrated in one hand. These ideas did not remain confined to elites. Over time, they reached the bourgeoisie, the educated, judges, and even some clergy. Not everyone called for revolution, but many began to doubt the justice of the existing system. People no longer asked only, "Why do we pay taxes?" but also, "Why do some people rule simply because they were born into a certain family?" For the first time, the concept of citizenship began to replace that of subjecthood. Individuals no longer saw themselves as dependents, but as people with opinions, rights, and voices, even if those voices were not yet heard. It is important to understand that this phase was not marked by violence, crowds, or falling prisons. It was a quiet revolution without bloodshed, but with profound impact. It changed how people saw themselves and how they viewed authority. Thus, before crowds filled the streets and slogans were raised, the battle had already begun in an invisible place that could not be stopped. As these ideas spread, the crisis could no longer be confined to money or the royal palace. When minds change, they seek a place to express themselves, and at this moment, authority would be forced into direct confrontation. In the spring of 1789, the French monarchy found itself at a dead end. The treasury was empty, debts piled up, and all previous reform attempts had failed. The king had only one option left, a step not taken for more than a century, and one that itself signaled acknowledgement of crisis, convening the Estates General. This assembly included representatives of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and common people. From the very first moment, everyone realized this meeting would not be ordinary. The problem was not the meeting itself, but how decisions were made within it. Tradition dictated that each estate had one vote, allowing the first two estates to always outvote the third estate. But representatives of the common people no longer accepted this. They argued that they represented the vast majority of France and that voting should be by head, not by estate. The dispute quickly shifted from a procedural issue to a political confrontation. The nobility clung to the old system, the clergy were divided, and representatives of the Third Estate began to feel that they would not be heard unless the rules themselves changed. In a decisive moment, they declared that they did not represent just one estate, but the nation, and called themselves the National Assembly. This declaration was dangerous. For the first time, an authority claimed legitimacy from the people, not the king. The government tried to stop this path by closing the meeting hall, but instead of retreating, the members moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, in a scene etched into memory, they took a collective oath. They would not disperse or return home until France had a constitution. Few words, but enough to shake the foundations of the old regime. This was not an armed revolution. No weapons were raised, no blood spilled. But it was an open rebellion against absolute monarchy, a legal, moral, and political rebellion. From that moment on, the crisis was no longer just about money. It became a crisis of legitimacy. Who had the right to rule, the king alone, or the nation? The questions raised inside the hall echoed in the streets. People who had watched from afar began to sense that something monumental was happening, and that decisions were no longer made solely behind closed doors. Here, the political crisis turned into the beginning of a real revolution, one that began not with weapons, but with words, an oath, and the will to stand together. As the conflict moved from halls into public awareness and tension grew in the capital, events became impossible to contain. In the streets of Paris, anger took on a new form and soon sought a symbol to bring down openly. In the summer of 1789, Paris was tense. News from the palace was confusing, prices were rising, bread was scarce, and rumors spread faster than facts. People felt something was being prepared in secret. Troops moved around the capital, and there were whispers of using force to end what the National Assembly had begun. Fear was not just visible, it was tangible. On the morning of July 14, crowds gathered seeking weapons. The goal was not to overthrow the system that day, but to protect the city and what they believed was their new voice. They first went to arms depots, then their eyes turned toward one place, not the most important militarily, but the heaviest symbolically, the Bastille. The Bastille was an old fortress with thick walls and high towers, used to imprison those who angered authority. Few prisoners were inside, but its reputation was immense, a symbol of fear and arbitrary power. When the crowds arrived, there was no clear plan, no single leader, no central command, only anger, fear, and the feeling that this place embodied everything they wanted to destroy. Negotiations began, tension rose, and then shots were fired. No one knows exactly who fired first, but what is certain is that the point of no return had been crossed. After hours of fighting, the fortress fell. The gates opened, the prisoners emerged, but the event was far greater than them all. The fall of the Bastille was not a military victory in the traditional sense. It did not end the monarchy or topple the government, but it did something more dangerous. It broke the barrier of fear. For the first time, people saw a symbol of authority fall by their own hands, not by royal order or official decree, but through collective action. News spread across France like wildfire. Towns, villages, and provinces realized that what happened in Paris was not an isolated incident. Even the king realized, too late, that control had been lost. Authority built on awe and fear had lost one of its core symbols. From that day on, the revolution was no longer an idea debated or a crisis managed. It became a living reality. With the fall of the Bastille, the question was no longer whether France would change, but how humanity, law, and power would be redefined. After the Bastille fell, the revolution entered a new phase. It was no longer merely protest or rebellion against a symbol of authority, but a serious attempt to redefine the relationship between individual and state. In late summer 1789, the members of the National Assembly gathered, aware that if the revolution did not express itself clearly, chaos might consume it. The question was simple in appearance, profound in meaning. What rights does a human being possess simply by being human? In this atmosphere, a new document was born, not an ordinary law nor a temporary decree, but a declaration of principles upon which the new state should stand, the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. This declaration did not speak only to France, but to humanity as a whole. It mentioned no classes, titles, or inherited privileges. Its language was direct and clear, as if saying, "From here everything begins anew." It affirmed that human beings are born free and equal in rights, that law must be the same for all, protecting without discrimination. Law was no longer a tool of authority, but a higher reference even for rulers themselves. It spoke of freedom not as chaos, but as a regulated right bounded by the freedom of others. Freedom of opinion, expression, and thought became recognized principles, not crimes. One of its most dangerous ideas was sovereignty, no longer reserved for the king or granted by divine right. Sovereignty belonged to the nation, the citizens who grant authority and can withdraw it. For the first time in French history, a person was not defined as a subject or a tax number, but as a citizen with rights and duties, theoretically possessing a place in decision-making. This declaration did not end the struggle. Many of its principles remained ink on paper at first, but its impact was profound. It set a new standard, created a promise, and generated expectations that would be hard to reverse. Its words spread through streets, cafes, and even distant villages. People did not understand all its details, but they grasped its core idea. From now on, the state should be built for the human being, not the reverse. Thus, the revolution transformed from protest into an intellectual and legal project, ambitious and hopeful, but also opening the door to new conflicts. As principles turned into written promises, the hardest question emerged. Could these ideas be applied in a state where a king still ruled? Could the revolution coexist with the throne, even temporarily? After the declaration, France tried to walk a tightrope, a revolution demanding change, and a state still headed by a king. The apparent solution was constitutional monarchy. The king would remain, but his powers would be limited by a constitution and shared with elected institutions. In 1791, a new constitution was approved, making the king the highest official in the state, not an absolute ruler. On paper, this was a revolutionary victory and a compromise ending conflict. In reality, trust between king and people had eroded. Many doubted the king's intentions, seeing his acceptance of the constitution as forced, not sincere. Then one quiet night, what remained of this fragile balance shattered. King Louis XVI attempted to flee France with his family, hoping to reach safety and reorganize with foreign support. The attempt failed. He was recognized and returned to Paris. This was not merely a personal failure, it was a decisive moment in revolutionary consciousness. To many, the king was no longer a hesitant partner, but a traitor to the new project. From that moment, monarchy itself seemed unsustainable. Debate shifted from limiting the king's power to questioning his existence. Pressure increased, the streets grew harsher, and revolutionary clubs gained influence. Amid external wars and fear of the old regime's return, the revolution moved toward more radical decisions. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished and the republic declared. The king was no longer a king, but a citizen with an ordinary name, accountable like anyone else. His trial followed, a trial not only legal but symbolic. In winter 1793, the death sentence was issued. On the day of execution, the king stood silently on the platform, watched by crowds witnessing an unthinkable moment. With the fall of the blade, it was not only a man who died, but the idea of hereditary, absolute rule and unaccountable authority. This was the point of no return. From here, the revolution no longer sought to reform the old system, but to build a new one, whatever the cost. With the king's fall, the revolution entered a darker phase. Fear became a companion to decision-making, and preserving the revolution justified everything. In this climate, the reign of terror was born. After the king's execution, France entered an unprecedented phase. The enemy was no longer clear. It was not a king, palace, or prison to storm, but fear itself. The young republic was born in a difficult time, wars at the borders, enemies within, and constant fear of the old regime's return. In this turmoil, the revolution changed its face. Revolutionary committees emerged, created in the name of protecting the republic. Initially seen as temporary necessities, they soon redefined everything. By 1793, real power lay in small committees, most notably the Committee of Public Safety. New figures rose, figures who believed the revolution could only be protected through severity, and that mercy could be betrayal. Among them stood Maximilien Robespierre, a man deeply committed to revolutionary principles, but convinced that anyone opposing the revolution must be eradicated. Revolutionary tribunals worked at a rapid pace. Trials were short, suspicion sufficient for conviction. Justice promised to all became a harsh tool wielded in the name of the people, but without their true voice. Executions became daily scenes, not only for nobles or royalists, but for former revolutionaries, politicians, and ordinary citizens accused of disloyalty. Fear entered homes, people whispered instead of speaking, friendships dissolved, silence became survival. The cruel paradox was that a revolution raising the banner of freedom came to be ruled by fear, not always because its leaders sought evil, but because they believed any leniency could bring back the past. By 1794, the terror reached its peak, but violence, once unleashed, began to consume its creators. Suspicion reached the leaders themselves. Allies became enemies. In a sudden turn, Robespierre was arrested, tried, and executed by the same instrument he had used on so many others. With his fall, the reign of terror officially ended, but its scars remained. Society emerged exhausted, bloodied, and distrustful. It was clear the revolution could not continue this way. The country needed a pause, a breath, an end to the bleeding. With the fall of the terror's leaders, questions did not disappear, they changed. The question was no longer how to protect the revolution, but how to end it without losing everything achieved. From this collective exhaustion, a new path emerged, led by a man from the battlefields into a different era. After the terror, France entered a heavy silence, not peace, but fatigue. Years of fear, bloodshed, and division had drained society. People no longer sought more slogans or fiery speeches. They wanted something simpler and harder at once: stability. The post-terror government tried to steer away from extremism. Harsh measures were repealed, executions slowed, but trust was not easily restored. The revolution that promised freedom left behind a memory heavy with fear. By the mid-1790s, France lived in fragile balance: no king, no all-encompassing terror, no clear vision. The economy was weak, politics unstable, and armies stationed on the borders. In this vacuum, a new star rose, not in debate halls or political clubs, but on battlefields. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. A young officer, calm in appearance and firm in decision, Napoleon achieved striking military victories and showed rare organizational skill. To a people tired of chaos, he seemed different. He spoke little of revolution and raised few slogans, but promised something tangible: order. Over time, his influence extended beyond the army. Politicians saw him as a temporary ally. The people saw him as someone who might end disorder. In 1799, a decisive moment came. Supported by forces within the state, Napoleon moved and ended the existing system, not in the name of revolution or monarchy, but in the name of saving the state. With this shift, the French Revolution in its original form ended. Its ideas did not disappear, but the era of open revolution did. A few years later, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, and France entered an entirely new phase, rebuilding the state not on hereditary privilege or committee chaos, but on strong central authority. It was a paradoxical ending, a revolution against absolute rule paving the way for a single ruler. Yet the difference was clear: the world was no longer the same, and neither were the people. What ended was not the idea of freedom, but the era of open revolution. What began was the age of the modern state, with all its contradictions. When the revolutionary era ended, its effects did not. The ideas born in France crossed borders, reaching peoples who had never heard of the Bastille. Thus began a longer story, the legacy the French Revolution left to the world. When the storm calmed in France, cannons fell silent and guillotines were dismantled, but the revolution did not truly end, it merely changed form. What it left behind was not a single system or constitution, but a new way of understanding the relationship between human beings and power. Across Europe, monarchies watched France with concern. Ideas know no borders. The belief that the people are the source of legitimacy and that law stands above rulers spread from country to country, first among elites, then among the masses. Throughout the 19th century, revolutions would repeat and systems would change, but one thing would not return. Absolute rule would no longer seem natural, and hereditary privilege would no longer go unquestioned. The idea of human rights left its French framework and became a global reference. It was not always applied fairly or consistently, but its existence changed the language of politics, demands, and protest. Even in the Arab world, though later, echoes of these ideas arrived, not as direct copies, but as questions: who rules and by what right? What is justice? What are the limits of power? The French Revolution did not provide final answers. It opened the door to questioning, and that alone was enough to change history. It is important to remember the revolution was not ideal. Innocents died, principles were betrayed at times, and it turned into the opposite of its promises in some phases. Yet it was not merely a failure, it was a complete human experience of hope, fear, extremism, and regret. It revealed that freedom is not easily granted, and justice is not born complete. Before the French Revolution, history was written in the names of kings alone. After it, history began to be written in the names of peoples as well. For this reason, the French Revolution was not a passing event in a single year, but a defining moment that divided history into before and after. And so, between fallen palaces, born ideas, and unfinished dreams, the French Revolution remains a story of humanity, of the moment when people decide to ask questions and discover that the question itself can change the world.